Hello, this is Mark Cannella at the University of Vermont Extension. We're glad you found this website and found this recording. We'd encourage you to keep coming back to www.maplemanager.org in the coming months, as there are a number of new forestry and maple business planning resources and tools planned to be published. The following presentation was recorded on September 20th, 2020. Dr. Abby Vandenberg shares the most up-to-date research coming out of the Proctor Maple Research Center on fall tapping and tap hole longevity. Enjoy the presentation.
60,000, 80,000, 500,000 taps. Tapping early is simply something that is a practical necessity in order to get tapping, all the taps in time and an efficient way before the primary production season begins. So a lot of various reasons why tapping early, either with or without any kind of freshening, is something that might be considered. And as we are fond of saying at the Proctor Center, in maple research, there is nothing new under the sun. So fall tapping, early tapping has been studied in maple production starting in the 1960s by our colleague Mel Kelling and up to as recently as 2008 by Senator Acer. And actually, all of these studies found that fall tapping was a bad idea when it came to yields. But even just since 2008, we have had some pretty significant increases and changes in technology, specifically the levels of vacuum we're able to achieve consistently, as well as a level of sanitation that we're able to maintain. And both of those advances can really potentially affect the yields that we might get from a tap hole put in early in the fall. So it definitely, even though the previous work on this has shown that this is not a very good idea, it definitely bears looking at again using the technology that's available to us currently. Okay. So there are several questions when it comes to yield, comes to these early tapping and tap hole longevity strategies. And of course, the primary ones have to do with questions of yield and the overall economics of this of the practice. So the big one is, with early tapping, whether it's with or without any kind of subsequent longevity treatment, are we actually getting more sap than we would be with a standard spring tap hole? Or does it actually just make us think that we're getting more sap because we get some more, we're having sap flows longer and things like that? It's basically leading us to believe we're getting more sap, but there's actually not more sap there. A second question is kind of the flip side to that, and that is, are we actually, with early tapping, getting less overall sap because of the earlier tap hole compartmentalization and drying? So in other words, if we put a tap hole in very early, is the compartmentalization that begins as soon as we put that tap hole in too much to overcome and actually result in, even when we ream or subsequently refreshen the hole, it's too much to overcome and we actually end up getting less sap as a result? So that's a question. And then of course the big overarching question is, even if we get more sap than with standard tapping, are we getting enough to increase the to offset the increased costs? And then those are just the yield and economic questions. And of course, there's a whole host of questions related to the sustainability of the practice. So we know, of course, that we're getting more non-conductive wood, at least with the strategies of reaming or drilling the hole wider or deeper. We know that the size of the wound created by the tree, one second here, that the size of the wound created by the tree in response to the tap hole is generally proportional to the size of the wound that we make. However, what we don't know is, for example, so with our longevity strategies where we're making them wider or deeper, well, yeah, of course we're making a bigger hole. We know we're going to get more conductive wood, more non-conductive wood. But is it possible that because we're with these longevity strategies re-injuring the same hole again, is it possible that it's actually going to make more non-conductive wood than a single hole of that same size would have? And then we have other slightly more nuanced and difficult to answer questions. Things like, okay, if we have a longer open wound, so we're tapping the tree back and fall, that wound is staying open throughout the spring and the primary maple production season, does that leave it at an increased risk of infection and decay? And then the big question is that when we are tapping early, we are removing carbohydrate reserves, sugar reserves from the tree at a relatively critical period for the tree. So I put this figure up here. It's an oldie but goodie. This shows the concentration of sugar in the sap in a sugar maple tree throughout the leafless period, so all the way from November through May. And of course, we all know that there's sugar there all through that dormant period because it's that sugar that we want to exploit with this early tapping. But I'm putting this up here to kind of illustrate that that sugar is not hanging out in the xylem sap just to be there for us to take. It's actually there to do really important things for the tree. So during the dormant period, where there are no leaves on the tree, the sugar in the sap represents essentially the fuel that the tree actually is able to use to survive through the winter when there are no leaves to make fuel through photosynthesis. So these carbohydrates are actually critical to the tree actually being able to survive through the winter. And along with that, they actually provide some protection from freezing and some other functions too. So the sort of more difficult to answer question about the sustainability of these early tapping strategies is it's not just the effect of taking more, but is there an effect of taking carbohydrates out throughout a longer period of the tree's dormant period and at a critical time when it really needs those reserves to survive through the winter? So, and that is not a very easy question to answer at all. So, in part because of that, but also because I like to keep things simple, and I think it's important to keep things simple. Really, when it comes to these early tapping and tapo longevity strategies, the first thing that we need to do is actually figure out if there is a there in the first place. So in other words, before we worry about any difficult to answer questions about sustainability, we need to actually figure out whether any of these result in more sap and an overall net benefit relative to standard spring tapping. And that was the overall goal of the study that we did. And depending on what we find here, then we can decide whether it's worth doing, looking into, or whether it's needed to look into some of these more difficult to answer sustainability questions. So the overall goal of the study was to determine if these early tapping practices, with or without freshening, result in increased yields and an overall net benefit relative to standard spring tapping. And when I speak of overall net benefit, I am not just talking about, do we get more sap than it cost to put in the extra time and the extra tapping and things like that. We need to think bigger picture, the overall net benefit relative also to the amount of extra non-conductive wood that's being generated, the effect of that on both long-term yields and revenue. So it's not just a single year cost benefit analysis. This is a more long-term picture of the overall net benefits of these practices. And so important to mention, this study was initially funded by a grant from the North American Maple Syrup Council Research Fund, and we were able to get some additional funding from the USDA ACER Access and Development Program so that we could make it a long-term, a 3-year study instead of a 1-year study, which is super important. As you know, anytime you're doing a study on yields, it's really important to do repeat for multiple years so that you can kind of mitigate the effects of different weather in the different years. And in addition to that, we also had Lapierre as an equipment sponsor to help us. As you will see very shortly, they were able to help us help provide us with some of the equipment for the study, because the equipment costs for this study were astronomical. As you'll see in a moment, you'll get the idea for it. Okay, so how do we do this? Like many of our studies, this one was really simple in concept, yet very, very difficult to achieve functionally on the ground. So we had 7 different early tapping and freshening treatments, plus a control, so 8 different treatments. Each of those treatments had 10 trees, so we had a total of 80 trees in the study. The average diameter of those trees was just under 13 inches in each of the treatments. So we had trees of all different diameters, but the variation in diameter was spread out equally among the treatments, which is also important to do. And then each of those trees, each of those 80 trees, was plumbed into a single one of these vacuum sap collection chambers. The entire system was under very high levels of vacuum. And then essentially, once we tapped the trees in with their respective treatment, we would measure the sap volume and sugar content of that sap at several points along the production season. And so for many of these trees, that's a lot, because we're going all the way from fall to the very end of the standard maple production season. And so at the very end of the season, we can calculate the total yield for each tree, and then that allows us to calculate the overall average total yield for each of our 8 treatments. And then we, of course, repeated this for 3 different years so that we could get an overall really robust average for each of the different treatments. All right, and so here were the treatments that we actually used. This is the first year of the study. So all of the treatments that we're doing are relative to standard spring tap holes. So our spring control, these were tap holes that were put in at the standard tapping date for the Proctor Center maple operation, which tends to be in the mid to just 3rd week of February. I guess that's the 2nd week of February. No, it's the 3rd week. Anyway, around February 19th. So everything else is relative to these spring controls. So we had 4 fall treatments. Our first fall treatment was just a fall control, where we put in a 5/16 inch tap hole that was the same size and depth as our spring controls. And these were just let go until the end of the maple production season. We had a fall treatment that was a re-drilled deeper treatment. So in the fall, it was drilled with a 5/16 inch tap hole that was 1.5 inches depth, just like everything else. And then on the same date that we tapped our spring control trees, we re-drilled these deeper to 2.5 inches. We also had a fall ream and deep treatment, where we tapped with a 1/4 inch spout in the fall, and then reamed it to 5/16 inch wide and deeper, also to 2.5 inches deeper on the date of spring tapping. And then our 4th fall treatment was this kind of unusual treatment that we had this idea that what we would do would put a standard 5/16 inch, 1.5 inch tap hole in the fall. And then in the spring, we drilled a second hole 2 inches higher than that first hole. So a completely new hole, completely new spout, same depth as the control. And the idea here was, okay, we know some of these freshening strategies, they're going to make more non-conductive wood because we're making bigger holes. The thought was, if we could tap the second hole within the column of non-conductive wood that was already being generated by the first fall tap hole, that we could potentially minimize the amount of non-conductive wood developed by that second hole. And in this way, we could get the most bang for our buck. A completely new tap hole, not just a deeper one, but also less potential non-conductive wood. That was the idea there. Okay, and then we had 3 early winter treatments. So we had, again, early winter controls. These are tap holes we put in the early winter period and left alone until the entire production season. And then just like with the fall treatments, we had a winter deeper treatment and a winter ream and deep treatment. So those were the 8 treatments. Breathe. So in the year 2, we repeated all of the same treatments, exactly the same. We altered our control depth to 2 inches, just because it actually doesn't make that much of a difference. And then in year 3, everything was the same, except we ditched the fall second hole treatment, which I will explain why, and you will see momentarily. And we added a late season reaming treatment. Now, this study was focused pretty purely on early tapping and subsequent freshening. So late season reaming was not our focus, but because we had an extra treatment after getting rid of this loser here, we thought we would try it for 1 year. So we had these trees that we tapped at the same date as the spring control. And then after the temperatures had been above 50 degrees for 4 days, which is actually an indicator that Steve Childs uses and that he's observed after many, many years, that's really the date where, or the threshold where tapples really start to slow down. So we followed his indicator there. And at that point, we re-drilled those holes deeper to 2.5 inches. So that was at the end of March. And so just to kind of put this in perspective, one of the challenges, it also highlights one of the challenges of early tapping, whether it's fall or winter. These are the dates at which each of these different treatments occurred in the 3 different years. And I put them here to show how different they can be, because of course the weather can be very, very different from 1 year to another. So, you know, in the first year we tapped in the second week of November for our fall treatment. And the second year we were able to tap in the 3rd week of October. And that was based on basically our fall treatments were when there were, of course, the leaves had the leaves had fallen from the trees, so no leaves on the trees. And also the temperatures had to be below freezing. So we had to actually have freeze thaw for that to happen. And depending on the weather in a particular year, that can happen at very different times. And the same thing with the early winter treatments. These were tapped in so that they were, you know, that the fall period was definitely over, but they were also tapped in sort of after that was over, but also to enable us to capture any kind of sort of late December, January thaws that we had. And then also you can see here on the other end that the season end date varied quite substantially from year to year too. So that's something to keep in mind at any point when thinking about tapping earlier, is that some years the weather will really be different from one fall to another. And I actually, oh, sorry, before I go on, here are just some pictures of the chambers. And while this looks like a lot, I would remind you that there were 80 of them. And so this is I think slightly less than 1/3 of all of the chambers. There are a lot. And some images of fall tapping. So if you've never done this before, it can feel kind of weird. So yes, there are no leaves on the maple trees, but there's a lot of leaves left on other trees when you're doing this. Sometimes there can be snow, sometimes not. And another important note about how we did this study, these chambers, what we did, because, and this is something that's important to consider when you're thinking about actually making maple syrup in the fall and early winter, because when you're tapping in the fall and winter, things get cold and stay cold. In order to be able to actually measure total sap volume and sugar content, we had to be able to extract the sap from those canisters. So we actually put separate canisters within those vacuum chambers so that we could pull them out when it was time to measure the sap and replace them with an empty one. So then we could bring those containers inside, allow them to thaw, then we could weigh them and measure their sap sugar content with a refractometer. So definitely a lot of like literal heavy lifting to get this done. And it was a challenge for our experiment, but that freezing and things staying frozen is one of the big challenges of actually doing maple production in the fall and early winter. So it's something to keep in mind. And I made these figures of the temperatures for each of the years. And I'm going to not really talk about them because we're going to be short on time. But basically, and we can come back to them if there is time at the end, but I put them here to show how different years can be from one another. So, you know, you can have a fall where there are a fairly good number of sap flow days. And you can see here that the winter period, which didn't even happen, we had a deep freeze basically until mid-January this year. And so there were very few sap flows in the winter period. And again, years can be very different from one another. I apologize for speeding through these. So, and now, after speeding through all of that, we get to the actual results. So these are the average overall sap yields for the 8 different treatments for the 3 years of the study. So all of the individual years averaged together. And I put this figure up first that shows the total syrup yield per tap for the treatments with their standard error, their variation, to highlight 2 points, or maybe 2.5 points. The first is that even though we see differences in the heights of the bars here, I need to point out that from a mathematical statistical standpoint, there were no significant differences between any of these treatments. So although we're going to go on from here and talk about patterns and relative differences, from a purely statistical standpoint, there was no difference at all between these treatments. And one of the reasons for that is because there was such a high amount of variation, even within the same tree from year to year for the different treatments. So that is something to kind of keep in mind. And then the other reason that I put this figure up here is something that we'll return to at the very end of the talk today. And that was just to show that the yields that we got from even the worst treatment were really, really good. And that is for a couple reasons. It's not anything magic. It does have to do with the fact that we have an extraordinarily high level of vacuum, incredible CFM for a small number of trees in a very, very, very tight system. And of course, there are no losses here. And so what this highlights is the kind of yields we can obtain when we are very, very, very tight in the woods and very, very, very tight in the sugar house. So put a pause or pin in that thought and we'll return to it later. But when we want to talk about the differences between these overall treatments or relative patterns, I find it's more helpful, instead of looking at the actual syrup yields, I find it's more helpful to look at them as a percent of the spring control, because basically that's what we want to know. Did they do better or worse than a standard spring tap hole? So that's how I have it presented here. So the spring control is 100%, and these are the rest of the treatments related to that or with respect to that. And so just to kind of set the stage here, we've got our 4 fall treatments on the left and our 3 winter treatments here, our spring control. And we're going to ignore late season reaming because I'm going to talk about it special after we're finished talking about the primary early treatments. And so first things first, if we look at our fall control tap holes, so these were just the ones we put in the fall and let go, we see that they yielded on average over those 3 years about 84% of the sap of a standard spring control. So in general, that is a fairly sizable reduction in yield relative to just waiting until the spring to tap. So not a good indicator that this is worthwhile to do in terms of gaining extra sap, not to mention all the pains in the butt of what you have to do making syrup in the fall. Okay, and then if we look at that fall second hole treatment, we kind of have a similar story. We have basically that treatment yielded exactly the same as the spring control tap holes. So we got the same amount of sap from something that we had to visit twice and put 2 holes in. So from a yield standpoint alone, not a very promising idea. And the same thing with the fall ream and deep treatment. So these are the ones that we tap 1/4 inch in the fall and then ream them to 5/16 and 1 inch deeper in the spring. and they still yielded about the same as the spring control, yet with all that extra work and extra non-conductive wood. So these were definitely not sort of winners in terms of yields. But if we look at the fall deeper treatment, things start to get a little bit more interesting. So again, this one was tapped in the fall and reamed to 2.5 inches deep in the spring. And this one got about 116, so 16 percentage points more sap on average than the spring control. So that's kind of interesting. And then if we look at our early winter treatments, we can see that with the winter control, these are, we didn't do anything to them except tap them in the early winter, which was either late December, early mid-January. So they got up on average over the 3 years, 92% of the sap of our spring controls. And that's kind of interesting. It is less, but it may not be significantly less enough to make it, it basically, you're not losing that much, so that if you have to tap early for practical reasons, you can be reassured that there's not that much of a difference in yield. But there's certainly no compelling reason to put a tap hole in that early to capture those early sap flows and get extra yields, because it just didn't happen. But moving on to the freshened winter tap holes, there we see that both the winter tap holes that were reamed wider and deeper alone got about 120% of the yield of the spring control tap holes. So somewhat interesting. It is, we're raising eyebrows. This is kind of interesting to think about and ponder about. But one of the first things that I need to say is that we need to think about the tap hole depths that we're using here. So generally speaking, the control tap hole depths were 2 inches, and all of these freshened tap holes were 2.5 inches. So what these data can't tell us is, because we didn't have a spring control tap hole that was 2.5 inches deep, these data can't tell us whether some of the gain that we get in these freshened tap holes, whether they were only because the tap hole depth was 1/2 inch deeper, or whether it's because they captured some of the sap flows that happened earlier than the primary production season. The way this study was set up, we really can't tease apart those effects. We have done separate studies looking at the effect of tap hole depth and yield. And so we know from those that the difference in yields between 2-inch tap holes and 2.5-inch tap holes actually isn't that big, if there's any at all. So that suggests sort of indirectly that we're getting most of our bump in yield from capturing some of those earlier sap flows and not from the tap hole depth. But without that 2.5-inch spring control, I can't say that. So I'm hoping that, I know that Cornell is going to be doing some more of this work, and maybe future generations or WVU too. So I'm hoping that some of the future studies will take that to heart and maybe include that, so that we can help tease that apart. So anyway, that is that. All right, I'm going to skip through this in the interest of time, and we'll come back to it if we have time. So let's talk a little bit about late season reaming. So if we just look at the yield from the late season ream trees compared to spring controls, we saw that they got about 118% more sap from reaming them late season than the spring controls. And that ream late season happened on March 30th, and our production season ended 9 days later. And so when I first saw these results, I was impressed. I thought, in 9 days, 18% more sap, like that is interesting. But because we took the time to do all of that heavy canister lifting and defrosting, we have the sap yields for each of the different periods of sap flow: fall, winter, spring, and in this case, late season ream. So if we take apart and look at the yields of those trees before we reamed them in the late season, we can see that the late season ream trees were over 1/10 of a gallon ahead of the spring control trees before we even touched them. And so basically, after we reamed them, their production was relatively equal. So if we just look at the overall average, it looks like the ream late season did super well. But it turns out that that increase in production is actually an artifact, or largely an artifact, to the fact that the ream trees, just for whatever reason, had higher yield than the spring control trees before we reamed them. So this is one of those like very good examples of why we can't do a study just 1 year. If we just did this once and didn't have any other data, this would look like a great treatment. But here we're able to see, wow, that wasn't the reason. They didn't perform better. And we have no idea why, when they were essentially equal tapples to one another, they're just spring 5/16 inch tapples of the same depth here. We have no explanation whatsoever for why this group was doing better than this group. And it's a good lesson in why we do things more than once, why we have to repeat them. Anyway, so as far as the results of this study, late season reaming actually technically didn't really do anything. So I know that Cornell is going to be has been looking at this and is going to continue to look at this. So hopefully their work, and we may do some more work with this in the future, I'm not sure, but hopefully that will answer some of these questions and get us some more solid data. All right, so we've talked about yields. We have some kind of interesting stuff going on there with some of our treatments. The next big question is related to those sustainability questions. And the one thing that we can ask about, and that is relatively easy to answer, easier than the other stuff, is what about non-conductive wood? So we know that there's going to be greater wounding with our freshening, our longevity treatments. But the question is, like I said, how much more, and what is the benefit? Like, we need to weigh the benefit of what we're getting from these treatments in terms of increased sap yields relative to the cost of adding this extra non-conductive wood. So to figure this out, we did a relatively small experiment to determine the volume of non-conductive wood generated by 2 of our longevity treatments relative to control tapples. So to do this, we had 20 trees. Each tree received 2 or 3 tapples. They all received a control tapple, a standard 5/16 inch spring tapple. And then they each received 1 or both of our 2 of our longevity treatments. One of those was the fall ream and deep treatment, those 1/4 inch spouts in the fall that were reamed to 5/16 inch wide and 2.5 inch deep in the spring. And then we also did the fall second hole treatment, where we put in same as our spring tapple, 5/16 inch wide and a 1.5 inch deep in the fall, and then drilled that same size tapple 2 inches higher in the spring. And then, so after we did this, and I'm going through this really fast, I apologize, we then cut the trees down the following fall. We removed the slab of the tree that contained each tap hole stain column with a chainsaw, and then using a chop saw, cut each of those tap hole stains into 2 inch wide cookies, beginning with a cut through the center of the tap hole. And I apologize, I only have a stand-in picture of Mark doing this with birch trees, but pretty much the same thing with maple. I think you can get the idea. So we're cutting them in 2 inch cookies, beginning through the center of the tap hole. And then once we cut the cookies, we then photograph each one of those cookies with a scale and a digital camera using a scale so that we know exactly how big it is. And so we take a picture of each one. And I think I actually laugh when I put this up here because it's such a nice set of cookies that is really small because so I could fit it on one slide. So here you can see this is the cut through the tap hole going the top of the tap hole, and this is the bottom of the tap hole, so B0 and T0, and then this is going up in 2 inch sections from the tap hole, and this is going down in 2 inches in 2-inch increments from the tap hole. And so, like I said, these are lovely examples where the stain ends 4 inches above and below the tap hole, which in a study like this one is basically never happened. The stains are much, much longer than that. They look more like this, where you have them ending maybe 12, 14 inches, often 24, 28 inches. So you can see that there's a lot of cookies involved in doing this. But once we had all the cookies photographed from each of our tap hole stains and each of our trees, we then used image analysis to measure the area of non-conductive wood, the area of the stain or non-conductive wood in each of the cookie images. So repeat, repeat, repeat for thousands of cookie images. And then once we have that, we can take that area and then we multiply it by the width of the cookie, which is 2 inches, to calculate the stain volume. And because, let me look back here, because we know basically the size of the tap hole on the front face of the cookie is much bigger than it is on the back face of the cookie. In order to calculate the average volume of stain in any individual cookie, we basically average it with the front and back of the stain so that we can get an overall average size of that stain within that 2-inch cookie. Now, of course, that's not perfect. It would be way better if we could cut tiny, tiny, like millimeter wide sections to really fully measure that stain, you know, like an MRI would do of our bodies, but our technology isn't there. We have chainsaws and chop saws and not MRIs. And trust me, this is definitely a way that is pretty solid and precise enough to calculate and measure exactly how much non-conductive wood there is, even though it's a little bit, it's in these 2-inch increments. So once we calculate the average volume for each cookie, we can then add them together to get the total volume of non-conductive wood for that tap hole. And yeah, it's a lot to talk about. It's a lot of work too. And it's a lot. So because in this study, we have multiple tap holes in the same tree, we then can calculate what is the percentage of non-conductive wood from our freshened treatment tap holes relative to the control tap holes in the same tree. And the reason that we do this is because the size of non-conductive wood that tap holes make varies a lot from tree to tree, and also within trees, but most of it's between trees. And so by putting the control tap holes and the treatment tap holes in the same tree, it enables us to really compare apples to apples how big one stain is compared to the control. So here is what we found. First of all, now I can explain to you with real pictures instead of numbers why putting the second hole above the first was not a very good idea. So here is a cookie cut through the center of the original tap hole in one of those second hole trees. And this is a beautiful cookie. You cannot get it more perfectly down the center of the tap hole than this cookie is cut. So bravo, Brendan, who did this. And so when I first was looking at this, I was like, oh shoot, we tapped into some previous non-conductive wood. I'll have to throw this cookie out or throw this tree out. And then I looked at the cookie that was 2 inches above that one and saw what was going on. So we put a second tap hole in 2 inches above the first tap hole, and that is what we're seeing. We are seeing a completely separate stain, a completely intact non-conductive wood column from the second hole that we put in immediately above the first one to try and minimize the amount of non-conductive wood by tapping into the original staining column. And it turns out that no matter how close you get them, whether they are here, they were tapped at a relatively different angle than one another. So at first I was thinking, oh, It's just if you don't hit it at exactly the right angle, then you'll make two separate columns. But that turns out not to be true. Even the tap holes that we got relatively close or even perfectly in line with the first hole, they still made two completely separate non-conductive wood columns. So instead of, and here's just some more pictures of it. I have tons of pictures of it because it was really fun, like total surprise. Weren't expecting that. And here are yet more, sorry. But basically the idea was to tap within the same wound column as the first hole to reduce the development of non-conductive wood, when in fact we did the exact opposite. The tapping the second hole generated two complete non-conductive wood columns. So not a very good idea. And if you'll recall, you didn't get any more sap by doing this. So a really bad idea. So there's that. So let's look at the other treatment. I'll skip ahead to, I think it's, again, easier to look at these as a percentage of the control. So this is the total stain volume from our control tap holes, our reamed wider and deeper holes, and our second hole 2 inches above. So relative, it's the percent of stain relative to the control tap holes within the same tree. So always comparing within the same tree. So on average, no surprise, as kind of just we just illustrated, for the fall second hole treatment, the percentage of stain volume was just over double, 211% higher than the control tap hole. So just like we saw visually, this made twice the amount of stain. So we already know that's not a good strategy. We're throwing that one out. But if we look at the reamed wider and deeper, we see that they made on average just under 275% more stain than the control tap holes in the same tree. That is a lot. That means that basically by going from 1/4 inch to 5/16 and an inch deeper generated just under 3 times more stain than the control tap hole. And if we put that as, and you may say like, oh, well, it's a 2.5 inch deep tap hole and this one was 1.5 inch, so of course it's bigger. Well, it's bigger, but it's disproportionately bigger. So within our control tap holes, and this is, so we have here, I kind of have these reversed from the way that I should have them, but these are the volumes of the tap holes for the control and the reamed wider and deeper tap holes in cubic inches. So we have a 0.11 cubic inch hole for control, the 1.5 inch deep, 5/16 inch spout, and 0.19 cubic inches of a hole for the end tap hole for that treatment, 5/16 inch wide and 2.5 inches deep. And then when we look at the actual volume of non-conductive wood that is generated by those two treatment tap holes, we see that the non-conductive wood in the control tap holes is 38 times, the volume of it is 38 times the volume of the hole. The volume of the stain in the reamed wider and deeper treatment is 61 times the volume of the hole. So there is proportionally much more non-conductive wood from the reamed tap holes than from our control tap holes. So kind of quite a bit more non-conductive wood. All right.
So, this is Mark. Sorry,
yeah.
I just want to give you a heads up. It's about 10 of 8, okay?
I'm good. I'm on time.
Perfect.
Thanks, Mark. So in conclusion, if we look at, going back to yields, if we look at our fall and early winter tapping, so the fall and early winter tap holes alone, we see that they had respectively 80 and 90% of our spring tap hole yields. So what this shows is that tapping in the fall is really probably not an optimal strategy unless there are other compelling reasons to do it. Things like aiming for specific flavors and avoiding specific late season off flavors and things like that. We can talk about that later if we want. But really, other than like special cases like that, from a yield standpoint, certainly not an optimal strategy. early winter tapping with 92% of a spring tap hole, we don't see a significant reduction. So it's not a huge reduction. So it means that we probably don't need to be discouraged from putting in an early winter tap hole if we need to do it for practical purposes to get everything in. But there is certainly no compelling reason, based on these results, to try and put them in early to capture those early spring thaws. So really, that's kind of an interesting result, but also kind of makes everybody happy at the same time. All right, when we come to fall and early winter tapping with later freshening, well, we saw that our fall ream and deep tree, not only did it make more non-conductive wood, but it got us about the same amount of sap for twice or more the work. So that is really not a very good idea. But for our fall deeper, winter deeper, and winter ream and deep treatments, we got a little bit of a gain in sap relative to our spring tap holes. So our results suggest that you could get some more sap, a little bit more sap, or some modest gains in sap over spring tap holes. However, that comes at the cost of what we see as significantly more non-conductive wood, plus, not to mention, the labor for 2 rounds of tapping, the cost of the extra spouts, and definitely extra bits. We broke a lot of bits going to 2.5 inches, which is something that we can also talk about later. Okay, so let's talk about the consequences of non-conductive wood and adding non-conductive wood and some of the bigger picture costs here of these freshening or longevity treatments. Number one, when we put in deeper tap holes, you have a greater chance of intercepting existing non-conductive wood. When that happens, you make far more non-conductive wood. Basically, it explodes relative to what this single tap hole would have done on its own. So that's one thing. But then in terms of the consequences of adding more non-conductive wood, that starts with the fact that we have a greater chance of hitting it when tapping. The more we make, the more we have a chance to hit it. So this goes back to the fact, and many of you have probably heard me say all of this over and over again, apologies, but we have the proportion of our tapping zone that is non-conductive wood equals our chances of hitting non-conductive wood when we tap. So if we have, say, for example, 20% of our tapping zone that's non-conductive wood, we've got a 20% chance of hitting it. And if we have if 60% of the tapping zone is non-conductive wood, we have a 60% chance of hitting it. So our chances increase as the amount of non-conductive wood increases. And the important consequence of that is that if you hit non-conductive wood, you get significantly less sap. So a study done by my colleague Mark Iselhart was able to show that you get not just a little less sap, you get significantly less sap. On average, 75% less sap from tap holes drilled into non-conductive wood. So the greater the chances you have of hitting non-conductive wood, the greater the chances you have of significant reductions in yield. So if you're increasing the amount of non-conductive wood you're adding to get a small increase in yield from one of these freshening strategies, it can actually come back to bite you in the butt in the future by reducing your future yields. By increasing the amount of non-conductive wood substantially, as we just saw, you're going to be increasing your chances of tapping into it, and thus increasing your chances of obtaining reduced yields in the future. So as we always say, our tapping practices today need to balance the yield that we're obtaining with the addition of non-conductive wood, because ultimately it's going to determine the yields that we're able to get in the future. So circling back to our overall yields from this study, which were fantastic, probably before you consider putting in an early tap hole and freshening it later, and all the consequences therein, if you want to improve your yield, potentially consider some other strategies to maximize the yield that you're able to obtain without going to extraordinary lengths. things like maximizing the vacuum levels of your tree through two trees, through leak management, tubing system design and management, maximizing vacuum and CFM, reducing losses in the sugar house through RO management, through the filter press, getting everything that you possibly can out, finishing to the correct density, preventing preventable off flavors, and of course, all things about tree growth, health, size, tapping practices. And in other words, this is a totally separate presentation that we can talk about how to maximize the yield that you're able to obtain so that it's closer to these idealized yields that we're able to obtain when we have perfect vacuum, perfect leaks, and no losses. There are a lot of things you can do to get closer to this number before you go through something like putting in a second tapple or freshening a tapple. So if you're interested in hearing that presentation, let me know afterwards and we can set that up for later. But for now, I think that is more than enough. And if anyone, I know it's time, we're at time to end, but if anybody is wanting to stay and ask some questions, I am more than willing to stay as long as you want and answer as many questions as you have.
That's excellent, Abby. I'm going to click some buttons here so that people that do have questions can unmute themselves and ask them over the microphone. We've had a couple that come in over the chat box as well, so people can type that in. And then
I wanted to say, I think, I looked at the questions that we received ahead of time, and I think I answered most of those, but if I didn't get to them, do shout and let me know.
Okay. So folks, you should have the option to unmute yourself if you want to ask the question over the microphone. And then I will tell people with respect to the time, it's 8 o'clock. And if you have to go, we are archiving a lot of the questions that get typed or that get asked to our presenters. And in time, they should be up on the Maple Manager website in the Ask the Team section. So if you do have to get off, the recording will be posted on our website within the next week or two. So you could watch the tail end here of the Q&A. And any really substantial questions, we will also get added to the Ask the Team element of the website. And I'm going to mute off.
Hi, John.
Hey, Les, how's it going?
Good. I
Go ahead.
typed in about the spouts and drops and sanitation that you use. So I was just a little curious about exactly what you use there. You know, we're using check valves or standard spouts, and where's your vacuum running 24/7? Just
that, yeah, that is a really good question. Sorry, I didn't see the chat. We did not use check valves. And the reason we didn't, it was kind of a bummer, but because we used a 1/4-inch spout and there's no 1/4-inch check valve, we had to use all standard spouts, so no check valves. And actually these, you know, we are on you know, we typically use a 3-year drop replacement. So drops were not replaced each year, but spouts were replaced each year. And spouts were replaced with each of the freshening strategies, longevity strategies. So when we drilled a tap hole deeper, we would put in a fresh spout to maximize sanitation. And the vacuum did run 24/7, and we had VFDs, of course, so we weren't wasting like huge amounts of energy during all of those super cold days from October to April. But the vacuum definitely did run all the time, for sure. Did I get all their spouts, sanitation, vacuum?
Yeah, I think so. That kind of covers it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
No problem. Let's see if I can check out the chat here.
Yeah, I think Les was waiting to say something too. So Les, you've got the floor here.
Well, this is interesting. Very interesting. This is, I almost have been backed into a corner more than once down here in Ohio and West Virginia because of the reaming and the tapping and the bumping and everything down here. So is you going to publish any of this study in the immediate future?
I would say realistically, it'll take us a while to get this one published and out. This is, we just finished the sap yield part in 2020, and I was analyzing those cookies like up to last week. So it'll be a little while before we probably get it written somewhere.
Yeah, I found it very interesting that you didn't see a significant gain, but you didn't see a significant loss for tapping early.
Yeah,
That,
I mean, you mean with the early winter treatment?
the early winter or even into the fall, December treatment and so forth. Where I'm going with this one is if at some point, and one of the things that we're looking at down here, we could start correlating weather patterns that would give us where we could use those weather patterns as an indicator that this season might come to an end abruptly in February. This could be valuable information from that standpoint.
Yeah,
Especially, red maples and everything else.
I
That's
think
going out on a
honestly,
thing, but
I do think that in a circumstance like in Ohio or in a warmer climate, this also shows, tapping in fall or tapping in early winter in Ohio is not going to be the same thing as tapping in early winter in Vermont. So this gives me a little bit more more strength to say, if I was in Ohio, I would definitely be considering tapping at least in mid-December to try and, the sap flow season is going to end substantially earlier than April 23rd in Ohio, most parts of Ohio. I just wanted to say, trying to bring up, sorry, I'm trying to look at you at the same time as my PowerPoint screen here, but I wanted to bring this up. These were the yields. I'm not sure if you can all see this still, but these were the individual year yields from all the treatments. And I threw it up here just to say that in general, the treatments were fairly consistent with one another from year to year. So there weren't like huge differences in how one treatment performed in year one versus year 3. There were some, but they were mostly consistent with how they performed. So just kind of wanted to put that up there since I had a chance to.
Abby, there's one.
We're looking. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. I'm done.
Okay. Okay. Abby, there was a question that came in on the chat box a while ago, and I don't know if you'd gotten to it, so I'll just say it again.
Yeah.
The question was from Dana that the data was presented as syrup yield. Are there any differences solely due to changes in sap volume, or is sugar content being impacted by any of the treatments or the timing?
Well, since we measured sap sugar content for all of this, that takes into account both sap volume and sugar yield. So we didn't see, I mean, obviously we were seeing lower sugar content during the fall collection period, at least sometimes. The sugar content is generally lower during that time, but in general, the results overall reflect the integration of both sap volume and sugar content. And actually, to be honest, the yields and sap sugar concentrations in the fall were not as low as we expected them to be. They were sometimes quite surprising. I hope, Dana, that was a question from Dana. I hope I answered that. If I didn't, speak up. I'm scrolling through. So I'm seeing a question from Peter Gregg, which is definitely a journalistic question. So bottom line, don't bother fall tapping. And yeah, generally speaking, I would say from a yield, yes, I would say these data suggest that in most general cases, fall tapping seems like kind of not the best idea, especially when you factor in all of the difficulties that you can have with actually making syrup in the fall. Things like needing to tap on a ladder to account for possible 5 feet of snow that's going to happen in the winter. Once it freezes, like when you do things in the fall, when it freezes, it does not unfreeze or thaw out for a really long time. So if you are in full-on maple production mode and that happens and you don't have everything emptied, you're not ready, you are going to be hurting through, for a significant amount of the rest of your production season and when the real production season starts. So things like that. But early winter tapping, again, like I wouldn't do it in Vermont to capture earlier sap yields because the data clearly show that just putting in an early tap hole didn't get me anything extra than spring tapping. But it also reassures me that if I do have to early tap to get my 100,000 taps in on time, then it's not going to hurt too much. So that one is nuanced. And again, this is Vermont, and we come back to Les's question and thinking about places in Ohio. Well, those dates are kind of meaningless there because they have a completely different date of production season. So you kind of have to adjust based on climate. So tapping in what we would call early winter, say the third week of December, first week of January in Vermont, may not gain us much in Vermont, but in Ohio, it could be just what the doctor ordered. It could be very, very substantially important to get some yields that you might otherwise miss from a production season that's going to end earlier. Did that make sense? I can't see any of you, so there's like no nodding or no feedback.
It sounded great, Abby. It sounded terrific. Did you see this one question? Have you observed a vacuum loss by reaming or redrilling tap holes?
Well, that is a very good, thank you. Yes, thank you, Nicholas. That is a very good question. And because our trees were tapped by like the super tapper, the most, like the best of the best person that ever drills a hole, no, we saw no vacuum loss. They were perfect tap holes. But for sure, it is hard to make a clean tap hole when you're reaming wider or drilling deeper. It sucks. It is hard. It's hard to go in straight. It's hard to go in at the same angle. It is, so the chances of getting a not very clean hole and getting a vacuum leak are very, very high, I would say. Unless you're perfect, like the guy that does ours, like Wade.
Abby, this is Tom. I just wanted to double check. I think Anthony may have had a question. I just wanted to make sure you got a chance to get that in.
I could barely hear that, Tom.
Okay, as you're speaking of on tap or tapping in the fall, in Pennsylvania, we tapped half of our sugar bush, which consisted of 12,000 taps. We saw a huge yield last year. We are going ahead and we're going to tap all 24,000 taps this year based off of last year. So with all of your research done in Vermont, it's good for you guys. But I think to note, being Southern, we saw runs that were remarkable in the fall.
Yeah, I don't doubt that. I mean, like I said, early autumn for us is not the same as autumn in a different climate. And so where are you at in Pennsylvania, by the way, just so I can put it in context?
I'm in the Poconos.
Okay, so I mean, you're not too much further in a southern climate, but you are definitely going to have a shifted season relative to somebody in Vermont for sure. So that does make a difference. And so tapping in mid-November in an area like that or in an area like Ohio may get you significant yields ahead of your regular production season, because you could tend to have bigger runs there. But I do have to like put in the
Yeah,
caveat there that it's hard to answer those questions. It's hard to know how much more is more without a control.
well, that's exactly. This was the first time we ever tapped in the fall, and we seen a very good run. But it's also farming. The weather this year could be different from the year before. So, like since we had such a good one, my cousin and her husband are the owners of it, and they won all 24,000 in this year because of how good last year was.
Well, then maybe you could help.
And
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
it's it was remarkable. I was shocked in, but then again, last year for our season, we made syrup every month. It was crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We never froze really hard. It was actually hard for us to get all 24,000 taps in because we drilled a second hole for the whole fall tap, and we ran our all 24,000 for the spring, and it was tough for us to get all 24,000. Trees were running for the spring along with the fall ones. It was remarkable. Like just this year, we never froze.
Wow.
But then again, like when I talk to people in Vermont about our sugar operation, like our highest yield is probably about a 1.6 sugar content.
Mm-hmm.
And they said if I ever had 1.6, I wouldn't be doing it.
Well, that's just nonsense.
Yeah,
no reason.
but I hit 1.2s.
It's with the technology that we have today, there is nothing wrong, or there's really no issue with having 1.2 sap sugar concentration. We have RO, so it does not functionally matter. And it's important to know, like, especially
absolutely, that's what I said too.
Like yours, just because you have 1.2 sugar content doesn't mean that your yields overall for the season are going to be any less than somebody that's got 3.6. It's the total yield at the end of the season that matters more often, more so than just a sugar content and a snapshot in time. That's why red maples have excellent yields. People think, oh, low sugar content, bah humbug. Yes. But it's the total yield that matters. And again, I'm just throwing up those temperature charts in the background. They're just a mess to look at, especially for you guys out there. But just to show that there are really different years from one another, fall to fall, one year to the next. But what Anthony is pointing out is like there aren't a lot of significant thaws in Vermont in the January, late December period. So for us, at least in the 3 years that we did this study, there weren't huge opportunities to capture sap flows in that period. This is just not the climate where that's the period that that's going to happen. So it will be great to see the results of Cornell's studies, which are done in some warmer climate, same with future generations in WVU. This will really help. And I don't know if Les and his team are doing some reaming, bumping, freshening, whatever euphemism you want to use. I know they're doing some of that work.
We're looking at it
too in Ohio.
I can speak to what Anthony's saying here. I can understand his desire to tap all those trees early. I can also tell you that when we're using the split wood method, where we're tapping half of our trees early, half of our trees, I would say mid-season, we are doing a lot better. Last year, we pulled, equal amount of sap on woods that were tapped later and tapped early. You can't beat a fresh tap. That's all there is to it. You put everything in there and you get into a cold spell coming in. We get that down here. We're in Geauga County. We're at about the same latitude as you are. So you probably are up in the mountains, which gives you a little bit of advantage. But that's what we found. A lot of guys are doing there in Ohio right now.
Yeah, I think it's just a pure weather pattern that's going on for years now. That it doesn't turn absolutely cold until like December. The months of October, November, we saw huge runs.
Yeah, it definitely really, I think it's a really important discussion to have because it highlights that it is really important to do work like this in multiple geographic locations. You can't, it's just not all the same. So
Absolutely.
it's fantastic that we have this work being done in lots of places that can answer those kind of nuanced questions. But one thing that will not change for any of this where we do it is that extra non-conductive wood, and that is no joke. That is a lot. And that is a consequence of
Oh,
putting in,
absolutely.
especially with the re-drilling. So that's something to think about for sure.
Yeah,
So,
no, it's
Chill factor.
increasing holes all over the place.
Abby, are you considering a chill factor on these trees when you finally go into dormancy and figuring a number of days prior to when you can tap?
to be honest,
When the tree enters dormancy. Not all that I'm using the right terms or not.
yeah, no, I mean, that's a really important question. Like, really, and that gets to that kind of sustainability carbohydrate thing that I was talking about. Like, is it possible, do they need to have a certain period of dormancy before there is either, you know, a substantial amount of sugar there or we're not causing harm? We pretty much know from, I'm going to flip back to the way back here. We pretty much know that there is sugar in the xylem sap fairly right away when the leaves have fallen, when the tree is fully, you know, in dormancy. So whether or not there's sugar there, it doesn't seem like we have to wait for a dormant period to happen. But certainly we gotta wait a pretty long period for a high concentration of sugar to be there. That's simply not going to happen until the tree begins to exit dormancy. That high sap sugar concentration is because the tree is waking up. But in terms of like harm to the, or like causing harm to the tree by tapping early, like that's a difficult one to answer, a really difficult one to answer. So any other questions? I don't see anything else in the chat. Can anyone, is there, I can't actually
We're
see
scanning,
it.
Abby. I haven't seen anything add into the chat. Les, I'll just let you know, I did mute you because we were getting a bunch of feedback there, but you should be able to unmute yourself if you were getting ready to talk again. I don't see anything new coming in, and we've had a few people drop off, but there's still there was 18 or 20 people on until a minute ago, so people are interested in the Q&A for sure. I'd say it's probably.
I really appreciate it. I meant to say at the beginning to please hang in with me. I knew this was going to be long, so I really do appreciate everyone sticking around and hanging in for this epic presentation. But it was a big study and was, in my mind, worth giving it the full treatment. So thanks for hanging in with me. I appreciate it, guys.
Great. Well, I guess we'll wrap up with that. Thanks, Abby, for a presentation, sharing the new information. And as we said earlier, we're going to be back on in a couple weeks. So love to see some of you back again. Have a good night.
Bye, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, Abby. Appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Meeting.